Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a place most history books skim over, but which existed in every medieval city and town, the brothel. You find yourself stepping across the warped threshold of a timber-framed house, the door creaking on rusty hinges. Inside, the air is a mix of smoke from tallow candles, the faint sourness of ale, and the musk of too many unwashed bodies in too small a space. You probably won't survive this in real life. Let's be honest. If the fleas don't get you, the smell will. You stand in the doorway a moment longer, letting your eyes adjust to the dim light. A rush of noise greets you. The creak of floorboards overhead, muffled chatter from a corner room, the crackle of a half-dead fire in the hearth. The women who live here sleep in cramped upper chambers. Beds are not beds in the sense you know them. At best, they're wooden frames stuffed with straw, patched over with threadbare woolen blankets that haven't seen a wash in months. At worst, it's just straw on the floor, flattened by countless nights of restless tossing. Fleas thrive in the bedding, and lice are constant companions. You ease closer, taking in the details. The ceiling beams drip with damp, the air tinged with mildew. Clothes hang from pegs, rough-spun shifts that carry the scent of sweat and smoke. Privacy is non-existent. A curtain might divide one sleeping space from another, but sound and smell travel freely. The women here live elbow to elbow, hearing every cough, every sigh, every whispered hope. A mainstream fact you might find oddly grounding. Municipal authorities in some medieval towns, like Nuremberg or Avignon, actually sanctioned brothels. They treated them as a necessary outlet to supposedly protect the rest of society. Yet the license did nothing to improve the lives of the women inside. They were commodities, tolerated but never respected. As you wander past the straw pallets, you notice one quirky detail: bundles of herbs, sprigs of lavender or rosemary, tied above some beds. These aren't for beauty. They're desperate attempts at air freshening. The fragrance fades quickly, leaving behind only a ghost of green sweetness against the heavier smells of humanity. Some women even tucked mint leaves into their shifts, hoping to mask the odor. Whether it worked or not, well, historians still argue whether medieval noses were more tolerant to constant stench than ours today. Your hand brushes the rough plaster of the wall, crumbling beneath your fingers. Rats scurry in the shadows, emboldened by crumbs and scraps dropped through the floorboards. They gnaw at the straw bedding, adding their own restless energy to the night. It is a harsh setting, far from romantic notions. You realize each evening, here begins with resignation. The women gather in these spaces, knowing that rest will be fitful, that insects will bite, and that tomorrow will be no gentler than today. You hear a laugh, dry and brittle, from one corner. It belongs to a young woman trying to keep her spirits up, joking about how the fleas keep her company when everyone else is gone. You almost smile. It's the kind of humor you cling to when options are thin. 3 light jokes for you tonight. First, medieval fleas had no respect for personal boundaries. Second, the straw mattress was less memory foam and more memory of every other person who slept there before you. And third, the phrase, "don't let the bed bugs bite," might have originated here As very practical advice, you shift toward a low window and peek outside. Lanterns glow faintly on the street, casting wavering shadows through the slats. Men will arrive later, loud with drink, stumbling up the stairs where these women sleep. For now, though, it's just the oppressive silence between work and waiting. The women curl into themselves, blankets pulled tight, listening for footsteps that signal another unwelcome interruption. The brothel is tolerated, yes, but never honored. Authorities saw it as both a solution and a problem. It kept respectable wives safe from wandering husbands, or so they thought. But it also created a shadow population of women trapped in cycles of poverty and illness. The walls themselves seemed to echo with the contradictions. Sanctioned by law, despised by society, endured by those who had no other choice. As you settle onto one of those straw pallets in imagination, scratchy and uneven beneath you, the reality sets in. These women did not sleep to dream. They slept to survive. And even then, the line between rest and labor blurred constantly. The door could open at any moment. The night was not their own. The straw still clings to your clothes as morning filters dimly through shutters warped by rain. The brothel stirs awake, not with freshness, but with weary sighs. You watch as the women crawl from their pallets, scratching at bites, smoothing their shifts. There's no luxury of washing in warm water. There is barely water at all. A cracked bucket sits in the corner, filled from the nearest public fountain. It's cold, murky, and shared. A quick splash to the face has to do. Food, too, is scarce. Breakfast is hardly a meal, more a gesture. A crust of coarse rye bread, maybe hardened from yesterday, dipped in watered ale to soften it. Cheese, if there is any, is tough and sour. You chew slowly, not out of savor, but necessity, stretching each bite. A hot meal is rare, and usually comes from stews simmered with cabbage, onions, or the occasional scrap of meat, often stringy and boiled until unrecognizable. The women huddle around bowls, their faces drawn, their bodies thin. Malnutrition is a shadow that lingers over every table, a mainstream historical fact. Municipal records from cities like London and Paris show that brothel women were often forbidden from wearing luxurious clothes, so their garments were simple, coarse, and unmistakably marked their status. It meant no hiding in plain sight, no chance of blending in. Imagine going out into the streets and everyone immediately knowing where you worked. Privacy wasn't only absent inside the brothel, it was absent everywhere. You notice a peculiar habit as the day unfolds. The women sprinkle vinegar or herbs onto their skin, not as perfume, but as a desperate attempt at cleanliness. With baths rare and shared, and water itself a breeding ground for sickness, strong smells were normal. Still, they tried. Rosemary boiled in water, vinegar rubbed on the arms, even ashes used as a scrub. These were small acts of dignity in an undignified life. And in case you're wondering, historians still argue whether medieval people truly didn't notice their own smells, or whether they were simply more resigned to them than we would ever be. A sneeze rings out from one corner. Illness spreads easily here. Colds, fevers, stomach sickness, all run rampant in a house where beds are shared and bodies are constantly in contact. Women often patch themselves with charms or amulets, hoping to ward off disease. A quirky tidbit: some carried dried toads or wore little pouches of garlic around their necks, believing these could repel sickness. You might chuckle now, but considering the lack of antibiotics, you'd probably have done the same. The day is filled with small chores, and you drift with the women as they carry them out. Laundry is endless. Shifts, sheets, and towels are scrubbed in cold water with lye soap that burns the skin. Candles must be trimmed, tallow stinking up the air as wicks are cut. Floors need sweeping, though dirt never fully disappears. Chamber pots are emptied, an unpleasant duty that sends you gagging toward the door for fresh air. Humor break number 1. You suddenly appreciate your modern toilet like never before. Humor break number 2. Medieval deodorant was just standing downwind. Humor break number 3. If your roommate smelled worse than you, congratulations. You were considered the fragrant one. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere grows heavier. The women are tired before evening even begins. They patch their clothes, mend small tears, and braid their hair. No silk ribbons here, only rough string or scraps of cloth. They smear a hint of color on their cheeks, perhaps crushed berries, if they're lucky, to feign health. A pale face signals weakness, and weakness invites trouble. The hunger lingers. Evenings might bring a stew, thin but hot, shared in wooden bowls. Bread soaks up the broth, leaving bellies slightly warmer, though not full. The fire smolders in the hearth, and the women cluster near it, their laughter brittle. It's a performance, a shared attempt to forget what awaits them once customers begin to arrive. A memory drifts back to you from earlier, the herbs tucked into rafters. Now you notice more. Sprigs of sage drying in bundles, not only for cooking, but for warding off evil. The brothel is as much a place of ritual as it is of commerce. Every woman has her superstition, her little protection. Whether it's touching wood before a client enters, or whispering a prayer under her breath, she clings to anything that promises luck. And yet, as the candles are lit and shadows grow longer, the reality presses down. You look around the room and see faces marked by fatigue and resignation. This is survival, stripped to its bones. Eat enough to last the night, scrub enough to appear acceptable, pray enough to get through the next encounter. The day slips into evening, and with it, an anxious anticipation. You hear the faint shouts of men outside, their boots striking cobblestones as they head toward the door. The women straighten their clothes, glance at each other, and wait. Some wear practiced smiles, others avert their gaze. For you, standing quietly in the corner, it feels like the moment before a storm. The storm arrives with the slam of the front door. Boots scrape against the floor, voices rise, and the smell of ale and sweat pushes into every corner. You watch as the women brace themselves, faces painted with thin smiles, shoulders tense beneath rough spun cloth. It's not romance that enters the brothel tonight. It's danger, wrapped in laughter, sometimes cruel, sometimes careless. A mainstream fact here: many medieval towns tried to regulate brothels not out of kindness, but out of fear. They saw these places as breeding grounds for disorder, so they issued rules, like curfews for clients, bans on weapons, and restrictions on how loudly music could play. Yet paper rules are one thing, reality is another. Once men stumbled inside, drunk and swaggering, those laws became faint echoes. You hear a sharp laugh from a customer as he slams a jug of ale onto the table. The liquid splashes across the wood, dripping onto the floor. A woman wipes it quickly with a rag, eyes lowered, as if tidying the mess might also keep violence at bay. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The dangers are constant. A client might arrive merry, then turn violent within minutes. A woman might try to soothe his temper, offering ale or a joke, but there's no guarantee. You see one flinch as a man raises his hand, not striking this time, but reminding her that he could. That unspoken threat fills the room heavier than the smoke. Disease, too, lurks in the shadows. Some women cough into their hands, covering it quickly, knowing too well what sickness means here. Syphilis and other infections move silently through brothels, leaving scars on bodies and shortening already hard lives. The remedies? Vinegar rinses, strange ointments of herbs and mercury, whispered prayers. None of them worked well, but they clung to hope anyway. Historians still argue whether medieval authorities truly believed these medical inspections helped, or whether it was just theater to reassure the townsfolk. Exploitation lies not only with clients, but with the masters of these houses. You hear the heavy steps of the brothel keeper, the man, or sometimes a woman, who owns the building and takes the profits. He collects the coins, leaving the workers with scraps. Rent for the straw pallet, fees for the candles, even charges for food, all deducted before the women ever hold a coin in their own hands. You might call it a medieval subscription plan, except you can't cancel, and customer service is non-existent. Joke number 1. The brothel keeper eyes the women like a merchant surveying goods. His profit depends on them, but that doesn't translate to kindness. If a woman falls sick, she is often discarded, replaced by another desperate soul, lured by promises of steady work. You can almost hear the whisper, everyone is replaceable here. There are moments of fragile camaraderie. One woman leans against another, whispering a joke, the two of them laughing softly to ease their nerves. Another hums a tune, a fragment of a lullaby from childhood. These are the small rebellions, choosing to smile, to share a song, even when the walls close in. Joke number 2. If laughter is the best medicine, this brothel is running a very underfunded clinic. Joke number 3. Fleas, at least, are loyal customers. They never leave. As the night wears on, the dangers accumulate. A shout erupts from upstairs. Wood thuds against wood, and you freeze. Was it a fight? A stumble? A blow? The brothel keeper trudges up the stairs, his voice booming in warning. Silence follows, but it's the heavy silence of fear, not peace. And then, disease again makes itself known. You notice one woman pressing a handkerchief to her lips, the faintest smear of red blooming there. Tuberculosis, though they didn't have the word for it yet, whispered through these halls as surely as laughter did. She tucks the cloth away, glances around, and forces a smile. Survival means pretending strength, even when you have none. As you sit back, you realize the brutal arithmetic of this life. Each day, a struggle against hunger. Each night, a gamble against violence. Each month, a test against disease. And over all of it, the master's hand collecting coins, tightening control, ensuring the women never truly escape. The candles burn lower, their smoke curling into your throat. Outside, the streets grow quiet, but inside the brothel, the echoes remain. Laughter cut short, footsteps pounding, the weary sigh of another day survived. You lie back on the scratchy straw, listening to the drip of water through the roof, wondering how many more nights like this one these women can endure. The night thins into dawn again, the pale gray light leaking through shutters that barely keep the cold out. You're still here, tucked against the rough wall, listening as the last drunk voices fade into silence. The women move slowly now, exhausted in body and spirit. Some collapse onto their straw pallets without bothering to undress. Others pick at leftover crusts of bread, and one stares quietly into the embers of the fire as though searching for something that isn't there. This is where you notice it most, the fragile threads of hope that somehow survive inside these walls. A mainstream fact: church preachers often thundered against women in brothels, calling them lost souls. Yet paradoxically, some cities designated whole quarters where brothels were allowed, even taxed. The contradiction meant these women were scorned publicly, but depended upon privately, locked into a role they rarely chose. And yet, in whispered corners, dreams still breathe. A woman talks about leaving one day, maybe marrying a merchant who promised her a new life. Another dreams of joining a convent, imagining that the silence of a cloister would be kinder than the noise of this house. Historians still argue whether many women ever managed such escapes, or whether most hopes remain just that, fragile stories to comfort one another in the dark. The exploitation presses down. The brothel keeper tallies coins, frowning at what he considers short. Fees for food, for candles, for the very straw they sleep on, deducted before any wage. You realize survival here isn't only a matter of avoiding violent clients, but also of dodging the endless trap of debt. The women are always one coin behind, always paying for the privilege of their own suffering. A quirky tidbit surfaces among the gloom. Some brothels actually kept cats, not for charm, but for pest control. The cats darted between rafters, chasing rats fattened on scraps. For the women, stroking a warm, purring body might be the closest thing to comfort they knew. A scrap of affection in a world of transaction. You hear another voice, softer this time. She wonders aloud what it might be like to live in a village again, to see fields in spring, to breathe air without smoke and sweat. Her companion nods, though her eyes are distant. Perhaps she once knew such a life. Perhaps it's only imagination now. The irony doesn't escape you. Society framed brothels as places of sin, yet rarely offered alternatives. Poverty, abandonment, widowhood, all roads led here for some women. Escaping meant money, connections, or mercy, and most had none of these. You sit with them as the morning grows brighter, realizing that hope is both their burden and their survival strategy. Without it, the fleas, the hunger, and the blows would swallow them entirely. Joke break. Though it feels bittersweet, first, if medieval motivational posters existed, one would probably read, "Hang in there until the fleas let go." Second, The only guaranteed customer loyalty program here belongs to the lice. Third, calling these rooms accommodations is like calling a leaking boat a luxury cruise. Still, amidst the misery, humanity shines in small flashes. A shared song hummed together, a scrap of apple divided among three, a whispered prayer before sleep. These gestures remind you that survival isn't only about breathing, but about holding on to the idea, however faint, of something better waiting beyond the door. As the morning bells toll faintly from a church nearby, you close your eyes and imagine stepping outside, leaving the brothel behind. The air would sting with cold, but it would be clean. The streets would carry noise and bustle, but they would not carry the same weight as this house. For the women left behind, that walk into fresh air remains a dream, yet dreams are the only currency they can claim for themselves. And now, as the story quiets, let yourself drift deeper into stillness. The rough walls, the creaking beams, and the dim candlelight of the medieval brothel fade into softer shapes in your mind. The harshness lingers only as a shadow, distant now, like the echo of a storm that has already passed. You breathe slowly, imagining the straw beneath you turning into something gentler, softer, a surface that cradles rather than scratches. The fleas and the noise slip away, replaced by a sense of calm, a hush that spreads outward until the entire space is hushed, empty, and safe. The voices of the women grow fainter, their whispered hopes dissolving into the quiet. Yet you carry something with you, the resilience they showed, the way they found humor even in hardship, the way they dreamed even when the odds were cruel. Their struggle becomes a lullaby of sorts, reminding you that even in the darkest corners of history, humanity's will to imagine something better never disappeared. So, as your eyelids grow heavy, picture yourself stepping outside at dawn. The sky is pale, touched with the first blush of morning. The air is cold but pure, carrying the smell of earth instead of smoke. You walk slowly down the empty cobbled street, each step lighter than the last. The brothel fades behind you, not erased, but no longer pressing on your chest. You move toward a gentler space now, one built not of hardship, but of peace. The world quiets further, the rhythm of your breathing the only sound. Each exhale releases tension. Each inhale draws in calm. You are safe. You are distant from struggle. You are floating into sleep. And with that, we close the night's journey. You pass by the usual, blacksmith's clang, baker's warm loaves. But just around the corner lies a different kind of institution. No, not a tavern, though those are everywhere too. What waits here is a house with lanterns hung discreetly in the window, its doors not hidden but in plain sight. And the strangest part? This brothel isn't illegal. It's a public service. Imagine that. Officially sanctioned sin, advertised like fresh fish in the market square. You probably wouldn't survive long in this world, not with the mix of filth, fire hazards, and moral contradictions pressing in on every side. You shuffle closer and notice how the city council treats this brothel like any other business. It pays rent, it pays tax, and in return, it gets legal protection. Weirdly, in some towns, the same official who inspected bread weights also checked whether the brothel kept proper order. Medieval bureaucrats really multitasked. The justification was simple. Better to have a contained, supervised house than let chaos fester in alleys. A bit like taking out the trash. You don't celebrate it, but you also don't ignore it. This idea wasn't unique to one city. Across Europe, from London to Nuremberg, municipal records show brothels listed in civic rolls like stables or mills. The reasoning was almost clinical. Unmarried men needed an outlet, or so the logic went, and the brothel stopped worse crimes from spreading. Historians still argue whether this was truly about maintaining order or just about filling the treasury with another line of taxable income. Spoiler: the city coffers did rather enjoy the boost. Step inside, and you'd see more than lurid entertainment. Some brothels doubled as boarding houses, offering meals and baths, and not everything was scandalous. A quirky detail comes from Avignon, where city-sponsored brothels once had a bouncer whose official title translated roughly as Guardian of Public Peace. Imagine that on your resume. His job wasn't only to break up fights, but also to keep customers from skipping out on their tab. You notice how normalized the whole setup feels. Children run errands past the front door, merchants deliver bread, and priests stride by with carefully averted eyes. It's almost banal. Yet there's an undeniable tension, as though everyone agrees this service is necessary while also pretending it isn't happening. A kind of medieval don't ask, don't tell. You can hear the coins clinking as customers pay their way in. The same way they'd pay for a ferry crossing or a haircut. That's the strange rhythm of medieval cities. Vice folded into civic order, woven between cathedral bells and market cries. And while you might expect constant outrage, the truth is more pragmatic. As one chronicler dryly put it, the brothel kept the streets peaceful at night. Not exactly noble, but in a city where survival was already precarious, peace counted for a lot. Think of it this way. You've got muddy streets, chamber pots flying from upper windows, rats scurrying like they own the place. Against that backdrop, the city choosing to regulate brothels seems less shocking. Everything in this world gets managed somehow, whether it's pigs, beer, or human desire. And yes, some people muttered disapproval, but plenty also shrugged and said, "Better in there than out here." As you drift along the stone wall, you spot the city's emblem carved into the lintel. That little crest is proof. This isn't some underground den, but an institution stamped with civic authority. And that emblem means something else too. If you cause trouble inside, it's not just a personal fight, it's an offense against city order. That's one way to keep drunks in line. And yet, beneath all this regulation, the brothel is still a brothel. The city may paint it with respectability, but inside, the human mess remains. Laughter, bargaining, jealousy, the creak of beds that probably should have been replaced decades ago. In that sense, it's as chaotic as any tavern, just with a slightly higher entry fee. You pause to consider how thin the line is between tolerated sin and civic necessity. The medieval counselors probably didn't lie awake at night pondering ethics. They just wanted to keep the streets quiet and the coffers full. But looking back, you can't help noticing the irony. In a society that punished theft with hanging and heresy with fire, the brothel got a license. Talk about priorities. One final oddity before you drift deeper. Some cities even used brothels as landmarks in official documents. A property might be described as 2 houses north of the public brothel. Imagine explaining that address to your parents. Yet, for the medieval mind, it was practical. Everyone knew where the brothel was, so why not use it as a compass point? And that's how you begin to see the strange duality. On the one hand, sin contained, tolerated, taxed. On the other hand, a civic service, as if lust could be scheduled like water delivery. This uneasy balance is what you feel pressing in as the candles flicker low, as the streets hum with the muffled steps of night wanderers. The sanctioned sin trade. It's less about indulgence, more about order. And in this world, order is everything. You step farther inside, and suddenly, the illusion of ordinary business gives way to something stranger. Rules stacked upon rules, as though pleasure itself had to be filed in triplicate. The city officials didn't just permit the brothel, they micromanaged it. You notice the women wearing clothes of a particular color, maybe bright yellow or striped hoods, marks that set them apart from respectable wives and maidens. The idea was simple. If a man got in trouble for dalliance with the wrong woman, he couldn't say he was confused. The uniform made things painfully clear. It feels bizarre, doesn't it? Almost like a medieval dress code at a theme park. Except instead of cheerful costumes, these clothes branded a person's role in society. Historians still argue whether these uniforms were meant more as shame or as practical signage. Either way, they had the side effect of announcing someone's occupation before she even opened her mouth. You can imagine the embarrassment of trying to run errands dressed in the garb that screamed your profession to the whole town. Then, there were curfews. Yes, even inside these licensed houses, the women weren't free to work whenever they pleased. Many cities required doors to shut by a certain hour, sometimes by dusk bells, sometimes later, because neighbors complained about maize, fights, or just the sight of lanterns glowing too late. Think of it as a medieval version of last call. And if you broke curfew, fines. Always fines. City treasuries loved fines almost as much as taxes. Inside, the brothel itself had regulations too. Beds were supposed to be kept clean, though clean was a flexible word in a world without running water. Kitchens had to provide meals at a set price, usually simple stews or bread. And occasionally, a municipal inspector would drop by unannounced, like a medieval health and safety officer, making sure nobody overcharged. Yes, even Vice had customer protection clauses. Imagine someone in a fur-trimmed robe with a wax tablet, taking notes on whether the stew tasted fair. One quirky tidbit surfaces from the archives of some German towns. Prostitutes weren't allowed to wear pearls, gold embroidery, or even certain hairstyles. The idea was to keep them visually distinct from wealthy wives who might otherwise fear losing their honored look. It's hard not to chuckle at the pettiness. Basically, you can sell your body, but heaven forbid you copy my hair bun. You lean against the timbered wall and watch how enforcement played out. If a woman broke a dress code, she could be fined or forced to walk barefoot through the streets as punishment. If she got into fights, or worse, insulted a respectable wife, officials might even toss her out of the licensed house. Yet, paradoxically, these women were also under the city's protection. If a client became violent, she had the right to call on civic guards. It's a strange seesaw. Branded, restricted, controlled, but also defended as part of the public order. And the brothel owners, they weren't exactly free either. Some towns auctioned off the right to manage a brothel like they would a mill. The highest bidder got the license, but with it came the obligation to keep everything orderly. Too many disturbances, and the license could be revoked. It makes you imagine a medieval entrepreneur keeping spreadsheets of stew rations and bed rotations, trying to keep both customers and city council happy. One particularly curious rule shows up in Avignon. Women working in the public brothel had to appear in religious processions, but at the very back, carrying candles. You can picture the awkward shuffle, the solemn bells tolling, and then the city's prostitutes trailing behind like a reminder of tolerated sin. Historians still argue whether this was humiliation or an attempt to integrate them into civic rituals. Either way, it must have made the townsfolk whisper. You think back to your own world, with its endless bureaucracy, paperwork, and forms. Isn't it funny? The medievals weren't so different. If something existed, they regulated it. If it made money, they taxed it. And if it caused scandals, they wrote more rules. The brothel was no exception. Rules, uniforms, and fines, these weren't side details. They were the glue holding the uneasy compromise together. As you wander further, the rhythm of daily life becomes clearer. At dusk, you'd see the women hurrying home before curfew bells rang. In the morning, merchants delivered bread and watered wine at set prices, carefully recorded. The bouncer at the door collected entrance fees, maybe grumbling about paperwork. And over all of it, the city council hovered like an invisible hand, reminding everyone that this was not chaos. It was structured vice. You can almost laugh imagining a customer being turned away, not because of morals, but because he came after hours. Sorry, sir. Rules are rules. Or a prostitute being fined not for her work, but for daring to wear the wrong necklace. The absurdity is part of the charm, and also part of the tragedy. These rules built walls, both literal and symbolic, around people's lives, shaping how they moved through the city. And still, in the margins, little acts of resistance sprouted. Women sneaked out, dyed clothes forbidden shades, or smuggled in jewelry. Some even built reputations as favorites of powerful men, bending rules when it suited. Officials could find them, but human will always wriggles through cracks. You sense it in the laughter that leaks through the shutters, in the whispered conversations after curfew, in the faint clatter of hidden bracelets. So as you stand in that narrow corridor, lantern light flickering on plaster walls, you realize how paradoxical this world is. Here, in a house meant to embody vice, the city imposed a stricter code of conduct than in many taverns. Vice, yes, but sanitized, regulated, and wrapped in civic order. That's the medieval way. Even sin must pay its dues and keep its uniform neat. You slip back out into the street. The smell of smoke and damp straw thicken the air, and soon you hear voices rising, not from the brothel, but from the pulpit. The cathedral bells toll, drawing crowds, and a preacher mounts the wooden steps to thunder against sin. You can almost feel the spittle rain down as he warns of fire and brimstone. Brothels, he declares, are dens of wickedness, tempting the faithful into ruin. The crowd murmurs agreement, but you notice a few sly smiles and sidelong glances. Everyone knows those same sermons will repeat next week, and the week after, while the brothel doors quietly remain open each night. It's the grand contradiction: morality versus necessity. On paper, medieval society hated vice. In practice, it managed vice like city trash collection. Preachers warned men of eternal damnation, while the city council reminded them to pay their entrance fee on time. The dance between the two was constant, like a tug of war where neither side really wanted to win. You can almost hear the tavern gossip, where tradesmen laugh over the hypocrisy. Father Bernard rages from the pulpit, but wasn't his cousin seen sneaking past the brothel lanterns? Historians still argue whether clergy themselves ever used such houses, or whether these rumors were just a way to vent popular cynicism. Either way, the stories linger like smoke in the rafters. And yet, beneath the irony, there was a practical calculation. Many theologians, Aquinas among them, openly admitted that prostitution was a necessary evil. Without it, they feared men might turn to adultery, or worse, crimes against unwilling victims. Better, they reasoned, to keep lust contained in a brothel than let it spread unchecked. It's a bit like saying, if you can't stop the flood, at least dig channels to control where the water flows. The sermons didn't always fall flat, though. You picture young apprentices, faces pale as they listen, convinced that one visit to the brothel could condemn their soul forever. For them, the contradiction must have been unbearable. One authority telling them to stay away, another practically handing them directions. You probably wouldn't survive that mental whiplash, constantly being told your survival instincts were sinful, but also officially tolerated if you paid the right tax. Meanwhile, the women themselves walked a sharper edge, branded by uniforms, confined by curfews, yet tolerated because their work served civic peace. To be tolerated is not the same as to be respected, though. Some towns allowed prostitutes into church, but only in separate pews. Others forced them to attend confessions more frequently, as though their sins stacked faster than anyone else's. And always, the sermons hovered like dark clouds. One quirky story from Florence tells of friars posting handbills outside brothels, warning customers that demons would follow them home. Yet the handbills themselves became a sort of collectible curiosity, read with half a grin. Imagine paying for your sins and also getting a flyer as a souvenir. You walk through the marketplace and overhear merchants debating. Some insist the brothel lowers crime. Others argue it poisons the city's soul. A butcher shrugs, saying it's no different from taverns. Men will drink, men will lust. Better to keep it somewhere controlled. A priest retorts that vice corrodes from within. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly felt torn, or whether most simply accepted the contradiction as part of life. The tension plays out in festivals, too. During Carnival, when society turned upside down, prostitutes often paraded openly, mocking the very sermons that condemned them. Laughter mixed with unease, like a pressure valve briefly opened. Come Lent, though, the crackdown returned, sermons louder than ever, the pendulum swinging back toward morality. You glance again at the brothel door, now half hidden by dusk. Inside, voices rise in song, rough laughter echoing out the shutters. Outside, a friar walks past, clutching his rosary tighter, as if the sound alone could stain his soul. That juxtaposition, holy words and human desire, defines the medieval street, and you can't help noticing, for all their thunder, the sermons rarely closed the brothels. They might shame, they might scold, they might send a woman walking barefoot as penance, but the houses endured. Because beneath the rhetoric, necessity hummed louder. Soldiers, merchants, apprentices, they all needed somewhere to go, or so the logic went. And the city, forever practical, needed the taxes. Still, not everyone accepted the compromise. Reform movements stirred, whispering of stricter morals, of cleansing the city of tolerated vice. You feel the early winds of change as stricter clergy gain followers, as some towns begin to debate whether necessary evil is still necessary. That question won't vanish. It will grow louder as the centuries turn. For now, though, the contradiction lingers like candle smoke in your hair. The brothel stands, sanctioned yet scorned, its lantern glowing faintly against the gathering dark. And the preacher's words still echo in your ears. Sin, sin, sin. You smile faintly because tomorrow the same preacher will walk past the same house, and the same cycle will begin again. The night grows cooler as you wander further down the crooked lanes, and for the first time, you notice shutters nailed shut, doors barred, windows dark. Where once lanterns flickered to signal business, silence now settles like dust. The slow decline of the sanctioned sin trade begins not with one dramatic decree, but with little pressures stacking up. Reformist voices growing louder, diseases spreading through cramped quarters, and rulers who decide the city should look more pious on paper. You pause by a deserted building that once carried the city's crest above its doorway. The crest is chipped now, its paint flaking, a ghost of civic approval. The house looks no different from any other abandoned inn, except for the faint memory of what it once was. That's how decline often works, not with fireworks, but with shutters slowly closing until no one bothers to light the lamps anymore. One reason for the collapse was moral reform. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, preachers didn't just thunder against sin, they organized. Movements like the observant Franciscans pushed harder, arguing that tolerated brothels corrupted the soul of entire towns. And suddenly, city councils that once counted taxes from brothels started worrying about their reputations. Historians still argue whether these councils were swayed more by true belief or by political pressure. But the result was the same. Licenses withdrawn, houses shuttered. Disease played its role too. The Black Death shook Europe to its core, and in the centuries after, syphilis spread like wildfire. Brothels, once tolerated as necessary, became associated with contagion. What was once a civic convenience now looked like a public health hazard. Cities that once posted meal prices for brothels now posted warnings, urging men to keep away for fear of infection. It's hard to maintain the fiction of a public service when the service comes with sores and fevers. And then there's money. Ironically, what once sustained brothels, the taxes, also hastened their demise. As cities grew wealthier, leaders sought cleaner images, more dignified ways to display prosperity. A brothel as civic landmark no longer suited their ambitions. Merchants sponsoring cathedrals didn't want their legacy tied to tolerated vice. You can almost hear the guilds whispering, "We'd rather fund stained glass than stew pots for the brothel." You step inside one of these closed houses. Dust carpets the floor, mice scurry across beams, and the faint smell of mildew lingers. You almost expect to hear laughter or music, but silence presses in instead. A broken stool lies toppled near the wall, maybe left behind when the city finally locked the doors. Here is the physical trace of decline, ordinary wood and stone, emptied of its contradictions. Yet, as with all history, endings are never clean. Some brothels went underground, operating without licenses. Others shifted toward taverns or bathhouses, changing names but not functions. Human desire, after all, doesn't vanish because a decree says so. It just hides better. The moral reformers might have cheered when shutters closed, but behind the alleys, new doors quietly opened. One quirky tidbit surfaces from Venice. Even after official brothels were banned, the city allowed courtesans to thrive. Highly educated women who mixed wit, poetry, and companionship with their trade. In a way, prostitution didn't end. It simply changed costumes, moving from the sanctioned uniform of yellow hoods to silks and satins in candlelit salons. Decline for one form was rebirth for another. You wander back into the street, and the tension feels lighter now. With fewer public brothels, the sermons no longer sound like background noise. They start to win the argument. Families boast of cleaner cities. Reformers preach of renewed morality. But you sense the cost, a kind of silence replacing the noisy compromise that once kept order. Whether the streets were truly safer is something historians still argue about. Did crime increase without the outlet? Or did people simply find new ways to bend the rules? As dawn edges over the rooftops, the city feels different. The contradictions that once gave it texture, the sanctioned house next to the cathedral, the uniformed women beside merchants, have thinned away. What remains is tidier, perhaps, but also more brittle. You realize that the story of brothels as public service isn't just about sex, but about how societies manage their messes. Do they tolerate, regulate, and tax? Or do they outlaw, suppress, and pretend? Both choices leave scars, just in different places. The shutters stay closed, the crest fades, and the memory of regulated vice lingers like a whisper in the timbers. You walk on, the silence around you carrying more weight than any sermon. And now, as the last lanterns fade from your imagination, the city grows quiet, and so do you. The cobblestones stretch into soft darkness, and the sounds of bustling streets fall away into stillness. What once seemed noisy and contradictory, sermons against vice, councils counting coins, women walking in mandated colors, now softens into history's hush. You find yourself breathing slower, almost matching the rhythm of the distant night bells. Each inhalation feels like a step away from the confusion of medieval life. Each exhalation a gentle release of tension. The rules, the uniforms, the sermons, the slow decline, they become faint outlines, drifting like old chalk marks washed away by rain. The houses you've wandered past seem less solid now. The timber beams blur, the lanterns dim, the shutters dissolve into shadow. You are left only with the faintest sense of a city that once wrestled with its own humanity. And in that fading, you realize that what endures isn't the noise of judgment or the clutter of rules, but the stillness that follows. So let yourself lean into that stillness. Picture the cool night air on your skin, the soft hum of a faraway breeze, maybe the steady whir of your own fan nearby. The medieval streets have emptied, and you are safe, here, in your own time, far from the contradictions and compromises of that world. Your eyes may feel heavy now, your thoughts drifting slower, your body easing deeper into the mattress. The story lingers like a soft echo, but it no longer demands anything of you. Just rest, just quiet, just sleep. And with that, we close the shutters on tonight's journey. The first odd thing you notice is how official the whole setup feels. A brothel in a town like Regensburg, Frankfurt, or Toulouse didn't just operate in the shadows. It might actually carry a license stamped by the town council, sometimes with wax seals as ornate as those used for trade agreements. You trudge past guild halls where shoemakers or bakers gather, and then you realize the brothel paid a very similar kind of membership fee, as if desire itself were just another commodity in the medieval marketplace. The money, called Frauensteuer in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, was collected on a regular schedule. It wasn't a voluntary donation. It was as mandatory as the levy on imported wine or the toll for crossing a bridge. The joke practically writes itself. In a world where knights paid scutage to avoid military service and peasants owed grain to their lords, medieval towns figured out a way to monetize even lust. If you've ever wondered how creative city accountants could be, this was Exhibit A. The brothel master, often an older woman who had aged out of the trade, kept meticulous records. She logged how many women worked under her roof, how many beds were in service, and when the city officer would come by to collect the dues. Imagine a medieval Excel spreadsheet, only it's ink on parchment with the occasional doodle in the margin, though probably not the kind of doodle you're imagining. One mainstream fact that pops up again and again is that many towns directly owned their official brothel. Augsburg City Council in the 15th century ran what they openly called the Women's House, not unlike how a modern municipality might run a public bath. The rationale was simple. If you regulate it, you can tax it. If you tax it, you can control it. And of course, if you control it, you can claim you're protecting public morals. Historians still argue whether this protection was genuine concern for reducing street harassment or just a very convenient excuse for steady revenue. The sin levies could be startlingly precise. In parts of Italy, a flat fee was charged per worker each week, while in Germany, it could be assessed per client visit, which required a rough form of record keeping that no one probably wanted to be caught reading aloud. Some cities even built brothels close to their gates, so travelers would pay not only the toll to enter the city, but also contribute to the municipal budget through a quick stop. It was fiscal efficiency, medieval style. Bundle your temptations with your tolls. Of course, quirky details abound. In Zurich, at one point, the women in the city brothel were officially given uniforms, striped dresses that made them easy to identify. These outfits weren't just about regulation, they were taxable. The town made sure the seamstresses charged above standard rates, and a slice of that markup went straight to the council's coffers. It's like when you realize the airport charges triple for bottled water. You sigh, you pay, and the machine rolls on. What's even stranger is how punishment and revenue blended. If a woman was caught freelancing outside the sanctioned house, she might be fined. Not jailed, not banished, but fined, and the money added neatly to the ledger. It reminds you of modern parking tickets. Sure, the rule exists to keep order, but let's be honest, the city budget loves the extra cash. Some guild-like features were almost comically bureaucratic. The brothel had to close on Sundays and feast days, a rule strictly enforced by the church calendar. But to offset the lost income, the council sometimes reduced that week's levy. So, you're looking at a medieval version of tax relief. Sin, given its own fiscal holiday. And here's a tidbit that edges into fringe territory. In certain cities, prostitutes were actually invited to participate in civic festivals, walking in parades in their distinctive striped gowns. The kicker? They were charged for the privilege, a special procession fee, justified by saying they benefited from the visibility. If you've ever rolled your eyes at paying for exposure in modern freelance work, well, congratulations. You've just discovered its medieval ancestor. As you drift through this strange financial world, you notice how the system wasn't purely cynical. Officials often argued that by channeling desire into official houses, they could prevent worse crimes in the streets. It's a debate that feels eerily modern, whether regulation curbs vice or just institutionalizes it. Historians still argue whether the medieval model actually reduced violence or simply gave it a shiny bureaucratic sheen. The taxes themselves could be so dependable that towns listed them in annual budgets alongside bridge tolls, market rents, and beer duties. Imagine a city treasurer scribbling 2 new mills, 1 repaired gatehouse, and 30 florins from the Frauensteuer. It's both mundane and surreal, as if no one blinked at funding road repairs with the money earned from bedsheets. And you, standing in that candlelit room with its heavy air, can almost hear the coins clinking into the city chest. It doesn't feel like sin. It feels like civic arithmetic. You leave behind the heavy wooden doors of the guild-like brothel and wander further into the town, where the taxes get stranger still. The cobblestones change beneath your boots, worn smooth here, cracked there, and your ears catch the hum of merchants closing up shop for the evening. In one stall, a woman folds bright woolen cloth. In another, a boy snuffs candles one by one, and you start to realize almost every little object around you, fabric, wax, bedding, was once harnessed into a system of luxury taxes designed to turn desire itself into revenue. The odd logic worked like this. If you can't easily tax the act, then tax the stage props. A loaf of bread or a mug of ale couldn't bear much of a levy because ordinary people needed them daily. But satin, silk, or even the humble bedsheet used in a brothel, those could be treated like little luxuries, and suddenly every thread became taxable. In Florence, for example, women working in official houses were forbidden to wear fine velvet unless it was purchased through approved merchants. Merchants who paid higher taxes for that very trade. You get a sly grin from the medieval councilman counting his coins. The rule both restricted indulgence and made it more profitable. And of course, the candles. Brothels burn through wax like modern cafes, go through Wi-Fi passwords. Wax was already costly. bees aren't exactly industrial producers, and local governments noticed. So they imposed pleasure levies on every bundle of candles bought in certain districts. If you picture a dimly lit medieval room with a single flickering flame, you might imagine it was about mood, but often it was simply economics. The darker the room, the cheaper the night. Here's one mainstream historical fact. In many German towns, prostitutes had to buy their clothing from designated tailors who charged inflated prices. This not only kept the women easy to identify in their striped or brightly colored outfits, but also generated steady tax revenue. It's a bit like how sports teams require you to buy the official jersey, not the knockoff. Except the officials here wore no crests, but plenty of bureaucratic smugness. The quirky fringe details are even better. In parts of France, authorities taxed not only the bedding, but also the laundering of that bedding. Records survive of women being charged an extra fee per washed sheet, with the justification that cleanliness contributes to decency. It's hard not to laugh. Imagine paying a tax for doing laundry while still being judged for the trade itself. That's medieval micromanagement at its finest. And then there's the feather mattress question. Historians still argue whether brothels that advertised soft beds were genuinely offering luxury, or if the feather-filled mattresses were just an excuse to tack on an extra levy. Some suggest the city didn't care at all what you slept on, only that the term soft became shorthand for pay more. If you've ever grumbled at hotel resort fees that cover things you never use, you know the feeling. You pass by a candle maker's stall, and the scent of honey lingers in the air. He stacks his wax carefully, knowing that somewhere down the street, those sticks will burn in a brothel, and the city will take its cut. You imagine him muttering the medieval equivalent, "Don't ask, don't tell," as he counts his coins. And you, trudging on, realize the system turned ordinary tradesmen, tailors, chandlers, laundresses, into indirect participants in the economy of desire. Some cities even imposed what we'd now call markup ceilings, but in a twisted way. Instead of preventing overcharging, they enforced minimum prices for the goods used in brothels. The reasoning was to prevent women from buying cheap substitutes that might let them slip under the tax radar. So yes, there were rules against bargain shopping for bedsheets. Picture a medieval Walmart run out of town by the city council because it threatened the tax stream. Jokes naturally bloom here. Imagine trying to explain to your landlord that rent is late because your candle tax ate your profits. Or better, "Sorry, I can't afford bread this week. I had to buy the deluxe striped gown package." It's both absurd and perfectly logical in a world where every pleasure could be measured in florins. One particularly strange tidbit comes from Lubeck, where women had to pay an additional fee if they wore jewelry inside the brothel. The rationale? Jewelry was considered ostentation, and ostentation had its own tariff. The council even inspected for it, an early version of the fashion police, except with clipboards instead of sunglasses. And so, the system spiraled. Clothing, candles, sheets, even the washing water, all taxable. Some scholars think this nickel and diming was actually more profitable than the flat brothel fee itself. After all, if the city skimmed off every transaction, then the more the business thrived, the better the coffers swelled. Historians still argue whether the councils were consciously engineering an economy of desire or just fumbling into it out of greed. Either way, the outcome was the same. Every sigh and every stitch lined the civic purse. You pause in a square lit by lanterns, and you can almost hear the faint scratching of quills in the council hall, recording the income. 5 florins from candles, 3 from gowns, 1 from laundry. It doesn't sound like much, but multiplied across weeks, months, years, it built bridges, paved streets, and funded festivals. The irony is sharp. The very structures meant to uplift civic pride might have been financed, at least in part, by the tax on a feather bed. And you, standing under that wavering light, realize that medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels. They depended on them. Not just for the guild fees, but for every candle stub and every washed sheet. The economy of luxury taxes had woven itself so tightly into the fabric of daily life that to pull it out would have left the budget unraveling. You drift now toward the looming shape of the cathedral, its spire cutting into the night sky. The bells toll, deep and resonant, and for a moment, you'd expect morality to slam the door on everything you've seen so far. Yet as you wander closer, you notice something strange. The church didn't simply condemn the business. It found ways to take its cut. The brothel may have worn civic stripes, but behind the curtains, priests and bishops often reached in with their own ledgers. One mainstream fact worth grounding yourself in. Ecclesiastical courts across Europe routinely fined women who were caught selling sex outside of official houses, with the revenue flowing directly to church coffers. Instead of casting stones, they tallied coins. Sin could be forgiven at a price. And unlike confession, these payments weren't confidential. Records survive of names listed beside fines, as neatly cataloged as a tithe. It was penance as bureaucracy, morality monetized. You shuffle past the cloister wall, hearing a murmur of chanting, and can't help but smirk at the double life unfolding. The church thundered from pulpits about chastity, yet simultaneously levied moral penalties that looked suspiciously like steady income. One bishop in late medieval England even imposed a recurring fine, not just a one-off, for women operating without license. It was the same logic as parking enforcement, recurring revenue disguised as discipline. And here comes a quirky tidbit. In some regions, prostitutes were required to pay extra during Lent. The rationale was that their work was doubly sinful in a season of repentance, so the fine had to match the calendar. Imagine your rent going up every December because it's Christmas. Festive for the landlord, not so much for you. Historians still argue whether these fines were meant to push women out of the trade or simply keep them on a leash that was too profitable to cut. Some scholars emphasize the language of correction, while others point to the sheer consistency of the income, which suggests a quiet tolerance. After all, if you fine someone predictably every month, are you really discouraging them or just running a subscription service? Inside the cathedral, the candles burn bright. Candles whose wax was taxed twice, once by city merchants and again by church dues. You stand beneath the vaults, gazing upward, and it dawns on you that some of the very stones were financed in part by the sins of the town. Moral grandeur built on a foundation of indulgences, fines, and subtle complicity. There's another fringe example. In Avignon, where the papacy temporarily resided, documents suggest that church authorities actively managed certain red light districts to ensure they didn't spiral out of hand. The papal treasury wanted stability more than abstinence. If vice kept orderly and profitable, it was tolerated. And yes, the irony of vice management under the shadow of the papal palace practically writes itself. You make your way back into the streets, and the contrast is sharp. On one side, the glow of sacred icons. On the other, the muted laughter from a brothel window. And yet, both sides might have paid into the same tithe box. You picture the town priest, sermon in the morning, ledger in the evening, adjusting his figures like any other administrator. The layering of penalties could become absurd. In some towns, if a woman missed confession, she was fined. If she worked during prohibited holy days, she was fined again. If she wore clothing too fine for her station, yet another fine. Stack them together, and suddenly her sins weren't just moral failures. They were a revenue stream as regular as any merchant stall. One of the most debated issues is whether these church taxes functioned as a shadow endorsement. By penalizing and then pocketing the money, did the church effectively sanction the system it outwardly opposed? Historians still argue whether this was hypocrisy or pragmatism. You lean toward the pragmatic explanation. Even moral guardians need roofs repaired and bells recast. For a moment, you recall the striped gowns from earlier. Those garments weren't just civic identifiers. Sometimes they doubled as reminders of shame when women were forced to sit at the back of the church in their distinctive colors. The catch? Even that ritual humiliation could come with an added fee, payable before Easter, to cleanse the books. Spiritual purity, bought in installments. And yet, there's a somber undertone beneath the comedy. Many of these women lived on the edge of survival, and every coin scraped together had to cover both the city's levies and the church's penalties. The system profited off their vulnerability. You tread slowly, listening to the hush of your own steps, and it feels heavy. The weight of centuries of coins traded for absolution. Still, the absurdity peeks through. Imagine explaining to your confessor that you sinned, only for him to nod solemnly and hand you a bill. That's less heavenly judgment and more like medieval customer service. And the customer, unfortunately, was always wrong. So you keep walking through the hush of the cathedral square, sensing the intertwining of piety and profit. Every candle flame flickers on both sides of the ledger, and you realize the church wasn't standing apart from the brothel economy. It was sitting at the same table, counting its share. You leave the cathedral behind, stepping back into the broader sweep of the city, where stone towers and timbered houses loom against the night. The mood shifts here, less about moral penalties, more about political arithmetic. For now, you're walking in the orbit of kings, queens, dukes, and mayors, rulers who understood something simple. If there's money on the table, they'll find a way to claim it. Brothel taxes, once little more than local guild fees or church fines, began to be folded into the grander fiscal systems that kept entire realms afloat. A mainstream fact jumps out from England. Royal revenues under Edward III occasionally listed fines from women of ill repute, alongside land rents and customs duties. These were not hidden as shameful, but itemized as practical. Across the Channel in France, some towns delivered a portion of their sin taxes directly to the crown as part of larger urban obligations. The crown, in other words, didn't need to run a brothel itself. The city already did the work, and the king merely collected the dividend. You trudge past the city gate, where guards lean on halberds. Once upon a time, towns placed brothels near these very entrances. The reason was logistical genius. Travelers arrived, paid the gate toll, and if they stopped at the official house, they effectively paid another toll of a different sort. And part of that second toll made its way up the ladder, eventually rattling in the royal chest. But quirks still lurked even here. In some German territories, women who married out of the trade were forced to pay an exit fee, not unlike buying out a contract. A portion of that went directly into the treasury. Imagine finally finding a way to start a new life, only to discover you owe a leaving tax. Historians still argue whether these fees were meant to discourage women from leaving, or simply to squeeze one last coin before they disappeared from the rolls. A fringe tidbit adds flavor from Venice. During certain festivals, the Doge's government taxed women not only for their work, but for appearing on gondolas in parades. The line between civic pageantry and fiscal policy blurred until it was impossible to say whether the event was about spectacle or income. It makes you wonder if rulers ever looked at the glittering canals and thought, ah yes, funded by our annual gondola gown tax, you turn into a narrow lane where town scribes sit hunched under lanterns, quills scratching furiously. These men created balance sheets that might include levies on salt, grain, bridge crossings, and then, nestled casually, fees from the municipal brothel. The inclusion wasn't scandalous, it was routine. And the more routine it became, the more it lost its sting. Vice turned into numbers. Numbers turned into budgets. Budgets turned into roads, palaces, and armies. What's fascinating is how loopholes began to close. Early on, freelancing could thrive in shadowy corners, but by the late Middle Ages, rulers realized they were missing out on potential revenue. So laws tightened. Fines multiplied. Unauthorized practice became a punishable offense, not because it shocked morality, but because it cut into profits. The shift is subtle yet telling. Morality became secondary to monopoly. You catch the scent of roasting meat wafting from a tavern and hear laughter spilling into the street. For a moment, you might mistake this for any medieval evening. But now you know that behind every mug of ale, behind every candlelit room, another ledger ticked forward. And somewhere in a distant castle, a noble balanced the books with money trickling upward from the town's so-called sins. One open scholarly debate lingers here. Did rulers deliberately protect brothels as a revenue stream? Or did they simply tolerate them out of inertia while reaping the rewards? Some historians argue that kings pragmatically encouraged their operation as long as taxes flowed. Others insist the crown merely looked away, unwilling to get its hands dirty. You can sense truth in both arguments, as the silence of these streets seems to whisper of convenience more than conviction. And so, the odd taxes that once seemed local curiosities became part of the very fabric of governance. Civic fees, church fines, royal revenues, layer upon layer, until the whole medieval state was entangled. You glance up at the castle tower, glowing faintly against the moon, and it's clear. Power rarely leaves coins unclaimed. Now, the pace of your walk slows, and the night quiets around you. The streets empty, lanterns dim, and even the clatter of scribes fades into silence. The tale of brothel taxes drifts to its close, just as the town itself seems to drowse. Your steps soften now, the cobblestones beneath you, no longer sharp, but worn smooth, as if centuries of travelers had already carried this story to its end. The houses lean inward above you, their shutters drawn, the windows dark. A faint breeze stirs, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and cool night air. Even the bells of the cathedral have quieted, leaving only the hush of the sleeping town. You let your shoulders loosen, the weight of the ledgers and taxes drifting away, leaving behind only the sense of stillness. The rulers, the priests, the council scribes, all their busy counting fades into memory like chalk washed from a slate. What remains is the hush of quiet streets, the gentle glow of a lantern guttering out, and the comfort of rest settling across the city. Your breath slows, steady and calm, matching the rhythm of your footsteps. The story has wound down from clinking coins to whispered silence, as though even the brothels themselves have closed their shutters for the night. You are no longer tracing taxes or arguments, no longer balancing guild fees against royal revenues. You are simply walking through a world at rest, a place where nothing presses on you except the soft promise of sleep. And so you pause beneath a timbered archway, lean against the cool stone, and let the quiet carry you. The night has gathered you into its folds, and with it, the story itself drifts away. Close your eyes. Let the hum of the fan nearby replace the distant murmur of medieval streets, and allow the calm to settle deeper still. The journey is done. Sleep comes easily now, like a coin slipping silently into a coffer. You trudge into the inn, and right away, it's clear this isn't a polished hotel lobby with keycards and polite greetings. Instead, the innkeeper shouts over the din of dice games. Children dart around barefoot, and the smell of roasting meat mixes with spilled ale and damp wool. Inns in the Middle Ages were designed for necessity. You're traveling, you need a roof, you need food, you need a place to stable your horse. But very quickly, those needs overlap with tavern life, where people gather not just to drink, but to exchange gossip, sing songs, and occasionally shout at each other until the constable is summoned. The boundary between inn and tavern is already paper thin. An inn offers food and beds, while a tavern primarily pours drinks. But if you're running the place, why not do both? After all, once someone has had a few cups of weak ale, they'll probably want something to eat. And after eating, they'll probably want a bed. So in practice, it's one big stew of hospitality, with inns doubling as taverns, and taverns sprouting makeshift sleeping quarters in lofts or stables. A mainstream historical fact here: records from London and Paris in the late Middle Ages note that many inns openly advertised themselves as both drinking houses and lodging spaces, charging travelers by the night while also hosting the town's regulars for daily merrymaking. But these records are frustratingly vague. You won't find a clear distinction, just a long list of complaints about noise, drunkenness, and occasional theft. And then there's the quirky side. Archaeologists have found playing dice and gaming tokens buried in what used to be inn courtyards. It suggests that gambling wasn't just an evening diversion, but an expected part of the environment. You walk into the inn thinking you'll get a meal, and you're immediately pressured to throw down a coin or two in a dice game you almost certainly won't win. This is less Holiday Inn Express, more lose your money in 10 minutes and then go sleep on a straw mat next to a stranger who snores like a blacksmith's bellows. The furniture isn't what you'd call inviting either. You get a bench, maybe a long trestle table, and upstairs, if the innkeeper likes your coin, you find a shared room where half a dozen other travelers are already asleep. Privacy? Forget about it. You curl up, hoping the person next to you isn't carrying fleas, and you're serenaded by the sounds of coughing, snoring, and the occasional rat scratching in the corner. Sweet dreams. And yet these places were vital. Travel in the Middle Ages was slow, dangerous, and exhausting. If you were walking 30 miles, you'd need shelter. Inns, for all their faults, kept people alive on pilgrimages, on merchant journeys, or simply on the road between villages. Some were even tied to monasteries, offering spiritual hospitality, though even there, rules blurred, and a monastery-run guest house could end up hosting rowdy feasts when the monks weren't looking. Historians still argue whether the term inn in many medieval documents always meant what we think it means. Was it a proper, recognized establishment with a license, or just a farmhouse that occasionally let strangers in? The debate rumbles on, because words back then carried shifting meanings. What you call an inn in one town might be described as a tavern in another. And in practice, they looked exactly the same. Now imagine yourself at the edge of one of these smoky halls. A lute player strums in the corner. A woman balances a tray of mugs through the crowd. And somewhere near the back, the innkeeper is slicing bread that looks like it could double as masonry. You're halfway between comfort and discomfort. Warm food, laughter, and shelter, but also noise, disorder, and an undeniable whiff of something more than innocent hospitality. And if you wander just a little further into the building, well, you'll start to notice that some of the beds for rent don't necessarily involve sleep at all. But let's not get ahead of ourselves yet. For now, you're simply drifting through a world where the inn, the tavern, and the bread and bed routine all blur together into one living, breathing tangle of medieval necessity. You wake slowly to the smell of ale-soaked wood, the clatter of mugs, and the hum of voices already spilling through the rafters. The inn you crawled into last night hasn't even gone quiet before it's filled up again. This time, less like a hostel and more like the town's gossip hall. Taverns in the Middle Ages weren't just about drinking, though the drink flowed endlessly. They were community centers disguised as entertainment venues. You sit at the edge of a long bench, rubbing sleep from your eyes, and realize that you've stumbled right into the heart of town life. The tavern is where travelers and locals collide. You might have a weary pilgrim just back from Santiago, a couple of masons talking about wages, and a clerk loudly bragging about the bishop's new decree. Everyone's here for the ale, of course, because medieval water isn't exactly your go-to beverage, but they stay for the chatter. It's a bit like a medieval Twitter feed, unfiltered, noisy, and probably full of misinformation. And the drinks? They aren't as glamorous as you might imagine. Ale was weak, sometimes sour, and brewed locally in batches that barely lasted a week. Wine was imported and expensive, meaning taverns that offered it catered to the better off. For most people, it's cup after cup of what tastes like slightly fermented oatmeal water. But after 3 mugs, you stop caring. One mainstream historical fact: English taverns were so central to life that laws were passed requiring them to display a recognizable sign outside. That way, even if you couldn't read, you could spot the alehouse by its painted jug or bunch of hops hanging over the door. And once you walked through, you joined a ritual as old as human civilization. Sitting down, sharing drink, and hearing the latest rumors. The quirky tidbit, though, is that taverns sometimes had unofficial mascots, pets, or half-domesticated animals that wandered through, like a goose that supposedly guarded an alehouse in 15th century York. Imagine nursing your drink while a goose nips at your ankle if you don't pay fast enough. Of course, you can't separate taverns from pleasure. Where there's ale, there's flirtation. A serving girl may linger a little longer at your table, or a musician might slyly steer the song toward bawdier verses. And sometimes, that flirtation isn't just playful, it's professional. Many taverns quietly offered connections to sex workers, or at least didn't stop them from working the crowd. After all, more drinks sold meant more courage bought, and more courage bought meant more business upstairs or down an alley. It's hard to tell where the line is drawn. Is this still a respectable tavern, or has it tipped into brothel territory? Historians still argue whether some medieval taverns were officially licensed as brothels or simply tolerated the overlap. The records don't separate the two neatly, leaving modern scholars scratching their heads. The noise of the tavern builds as the day stretches on. You hear dice clattering on the table, men cheering a lucky throw, a minstrel launching into a ballad that half the crowd sings along to while the other half groans. The air is thick with wood smoke and the sour tang of spilled ale soaking into rushes on the floor. It's raucous, smelly, chaotic, and yet strangely comforting. And here's a joke to keep you awake just long enough. Medieval taverns were technically supposed to close at curfew when the town bell rang. But curfew often translated to, let's just shutter the windows and keep the mugs flowing. So, if you imagine yourself as a medieval inspector walking through town after dark, good luck. Every closed tavern probably has muffled singing and clinking behind its barred shutters. The tavern is also where politics leaked into everyday life. A couple of disgruntled guild members could gather, complain about taxes, and suddenly you've got the beginnings of a protest. Authorities knew this, which is why taverns were monitored and occasionally raided. Yet, shutting them down entirely would mean cutting off one of the few outlets ordinary people had. Better to let the ale flow and the gossip churn, as long as no one carried it too far. By now, you're realizing that taverns weren't just about drinks. They were about connection. The kind of connection that's messy, unfiltered, and occasionally scandalous. And if you stay late enough into the night, the line between tavern, inn, and brothel isn't just blurred, it practically disappears. Upstairs, there are rooms. Who sleeps in them, or what they're used for, is another matter entirely. You glance toward the stairs and see 2 figures vanish into the shadows, while the lute player strums faster, covering the sound of footsteps. So you sip your ale, half warm and half watery, and remind yourself, you're not in a bar, you're in the nerve center of the medieval town, where beer, stories, and secret deals all flow together like one never-ending river. The stairs creak beneath your feet as you climb, following the faint glow of candlelight. The tavern's noise softens into a muffled thrum below, replaced by whispers and footsteps ahead. You're not just stepping into a sleeping chamber, you're stepping into a different layer of the same building, one that wears the mask of lodging but hides something more. These are the brothel rooms, tucked into corners of inns and taverns so seamlessly that many travelers couldn't tell where one service ended and the other began. At first glance, the room looks innocent enough. A bed, a stool, a pitcher of water that's probably seen better days. But the bed isn't just for sleep, and the lodger isn't always a weary traveler. You sit on the edge of the straw mattress, and it rustles in a way that suggests it's held many stories. Some of them whispered, some shouted, and some forgotten entirely. A mainstream historical fact. In late medieval London, records list dozens of stew houses along Bankside, technically licensed as bathhouses, but widely understood to be brothels. They offered food, drink, and a warm room, but the bathing was optional at best. Many of these establishments overlapped with tavern culture, making it impossible to draw a clean line. You might go for a drink, stay for a meal, and find yourself approached with an offer that has nothing to do with supper. And then the quirky tidbit, some brothels actually had themed names like the Cardinal's Hat or the Boar's Head. Imagine checking into what you think is a lodging house and realizing you've booked a night at the Cardinal's Hat, where room service comes with very different expectations. But here's where things get complicated. Historians still argue whether many inns and taverns actively ran their own sex trade or simply rented rooms to women who did. Was the innkeeper complicit or just turning a blind eye while collecting rent? The sources are slippery, leaving us to guess how formal the arrangement was. Back in your imagined room, the truth is hard to ignore. You can hear footsteps in the hallway, soft laughter, a door shutting quietly. Downstairs, the dice rattle, and upstairs, another game is played with different stakes. It's not hard to see why travelers found this convenient. Food, drink, shelter, and intimacy, all under one roof. Efficient, if morally questionable. And not just travelers. Pilgrims, clerics, even town officials were known to appear in the records of brothels. Everyone scolded the existence of these houses, but nearly everyone also used them. City governments sometimes openly taxed them, preferring regulation over chaos. That way, they could claim control while still pocketing revenue. It was a practical medieval version of don't ask too many questions. The atmosphere of these upstairs rooms, though, was anything but elegant. Forget satin sheets or perfumed baths. What you get is a coarse blanket, a musty smell, and perhaps a tallow candle sputtering on the stool. Yet, in a world of daily hardship, it was enough. These rooms were the shadowy counterpart to the tavern's noise, offering not rest but escape, however fleeting. And let's slip in a modern comparison for a sleepy chuckle. Think of a sketchy motel at the edge of a highway that also happens to serve cheap beer and has an arcade machine in the corner. It's technically lodging, but you know it's not really about the lodging. That's the medieval version you're sitting in now. Even the language reflected the blur. In some towns, the same word could mean both a lodging house and a brothel, leaving officials to clarify only when scandals broke out. And scandals were common. Fights between jealous lovers, clerics caught in embarrassing circumstances, or noblemen insisting they were only there for the food. The town records are full of denials that read suspiciously like guilty excuses. From your perch on the straw bed, you can imagine how easy it was to get swept into this world. A weary traveler arrives, pays for a room, drinks downstairs, meets someone friendly, and suddenly, the inn becomes something entirely different. No paperwork, no official distinction, just a blur of functions that made the medieval inn-tavern brothel a one-stop shop for human needs. So, as you lean back, listening to the candle hiss, you realize you're not just in a place of shelter, you're in a place where morality, necessity, and desire collide. And the line between them is about as thin as the mattress you're sitting on. Morning light seeps through a crooked window. The tavern's shutters rattling as carts roll over cobblestones outside. You pull your cloak tighter and shuffle downstairs. And once again, you're struck by how completely these places, the inns, taverns, and brothels, spill into one another. For medieval towns, they weren't just tolerated out of indulgence. They were woven into civic order itself. Leaders taxed them, regulated them, or condemned them. Sometimes all three in the same decade. You step into the street and feel that uneasy coexistence pressing in from every side. A mainstream historical fact. In cities like Nuremberg or Avignon, brothels were officially licensed by the council. They paid taxes, operated under rules, and were even placed in designated neighborhoods. It was seen as safer to control them than to drive them underground. And while you're shaking your head at the thought of civic governments running a respectable brothel industry, remember that tax revenue always sweetened the decision. But here's the quirky side. Some towns made sex workers wear special clothing, bright hoods, or striped cloaks, so everyone knew who they were. That way, the authorities could claim they were regulating morality, while also making sure the trade kept flowing under watchful eyes. Picture a medieval mayor sighing, "Yes, we allow it, but please wear the hat so people don't confuse you with my cousin's wife." The debate never really ended. Historians still argue whether these regulations genuinely protected women or merely exploited them further. Some documents suggest protections, limits on working hours, bans on underage workers, even occasional medical checks. Others show fines, punishments, and exile if women stepped outside the system. The records blur, just like the establishments themselves. For the townsfolk, these spaces were both scandal and necessity. On one hand, preachers thundered from pulpits about sin, urging everyone to shun taverns and brothels. On the other, council minutes show those same preachers quietly renting rooms in inns during synods, and occasionally being named in brothel scandals themselves. Hypocrisy wasn't just common, it was practically expected. You wander the street and notice how seamlessly the buildings line up. One doorway with a tankard painted on its sign, another with a crude bed, another with a name that could mean anything. To the eye, they're identical. To the town, they're categories in constant tension: hospitality, entertainment, and temptation, all pressed shoulder to shoulder. And of course, where civic authorities stepped in, trouble brewed. A crackdown might close 3 taverns, only for new ones to pop up down the block. A ban on brothels might last 5 years until the city quietly reopened them to fill the treasury again. It's a cycle you've seen before in history and probably still see now, just with different names and neon signs. At street level, though, the experience was simple. You needed food, you went inside. You wanted company, you stayed longer. You wanted sleep, you found a bed. And if you wanted more, well, there was always someone ready to point you upstairs. Medieval life didn't separate needs into neat categories. It rolled them all into one noisy, smoky, half-legal, half-forbidden structure that kept towns alive. By now, you can sense why inns, taverns, and brothels blurred so much. They reflected the messy, contradictory lives of the people who used them. Authorities taxed what they condemned. Customers scolded what they secretly sought. And innkeepers blurred boundaries because survival meant offering everything under one roof. And now, as the noise of the medieval street begins to fade, let's let our journey wind down. Imagine the clamor softening, the rickety shutters finally closing, the dice falling silent. The air grows still, and the candle gutters out. Those blurred spaces, the smoky taverns, the creaking staircases, the cramped chambers, slip quietly into shadow. You let yourself drift back from that world, back from the cracked mugs and uneven benches, into your own quieter room. The line between past and present grows hazy, just like those establishments once were. The laughter of the tavern becomes only a faint echo, fading further with each breath you take. And now, your body feels heavier, softer, as if you too have found a straw bed where you can finally rest. The candle is gone, but there's no need for it anymore. You're wrapped in stillness, in the calm of knowing that even the noisiest places eventually quiet down. The voices of travelers, the mutters of town guards, the clinking of coins, all of them dissolve, leaving only the steady rhythm of your breathing. So close your eyes, let the medieval street dim into nothing but a dream, and carry with you the comfort that history is never truly tidy. It is blurred, it is tangled, and that's what makes it so endlessly human. For now, though, you don't need to think about any of it. You only need to rest. Sleep comes easily here, in the silence after the tavern has closed, in the stillness after the laughter has gone. And if you let yourself drift, you might just wake up in another story tomorrow, calmer and lighter than before. Good night.